Now I'd like to move on to my esteemed colleague, Jon Hesk, who is a reader in Greek and classical studies here at St. Andrews. He's going to talk to us about Aristophanes. And the title of his talk is Ponēra orgē, the problem of anger in Aristophanic Comedy. Go on ahead.
Thanks very much, Adrian. Well, first of all, I'm going to just quickly thank Chiara and Adrian for inviting me to this wonderful and already fascinating conference. And it's great to hear all these great papers. A lot of hard acts to follow, and also to actually see some familiar old friends and faces and former students in the participants list. So it's lovely to see everybody. I also really want to quickly say that about Chiara and Adrian, I've never met them in person because of COVID and because of some tragic personal circumstances, but they have been wonderful colleagues stepping in actually to do my teaching for me for those personal circumstances. So I'm grateful to them for that as well. It's just wonderful to have you both as colleagues at St. Andrews. Right, let's get moving. I can explain why I've got the Chirac image and perhaps the other image up in questions if you like. There's a whole other half of this paper that I'm still developing that relates to the sort of more reception side of things and contemporary political and philosophical engagements via Aristophanes, if you like, but that's not what I'm going to focus on today. So recent work on anger in old comedy has tended to focus on one play, Aristophanes' Wasps. And by the way, you can follow along this talk with the handout or the PowerPoint. They're basically the same with a few differences. So whatever, you know, I've built in redundancy like NASA because I've done so much online teaching that recently that I've learned to do that. But you can experience this paper in those two ways, but I wouldn't try swapping between the two. Anyway, so yes, so Aristophanes' Wasps, and some have produced brilliant work on this play's comic investigation of juridical orgē. And we heard about Danielle in Ted's excellent talk. And here's Danielle Allen again. As Danielle has shown, Wasps is an important part of a wider Athenian discourse in which orgē is styled as a legitimate and ideologically charged democratic emotion on the part of the male citizen, especially with reference to securing convictions and appropriate redress in the people's courts. As she says here, the Wasps and Philocleon treat anger as the source of Athens' independence, greatness, and egalitarianism, and they conceive of anger as being necessary to their participation in democratic politics as free and equal citizens. The play does prove that Athenians could indeed articulate a coherent rationalization for the ways in which orgē might be seen as a fundamental principle and constitutive component of democratic politics. And Daniel also has interesting observations on the figure of the angry woman in tragedy, and I've got no space here to discuss that and the implications of it for my argument, but you can ask me about that in questions. Now, so that's one way in which anger in Wasps has been talked about. Others have developed metapoetic and programmatic readings around the moment when the Wasp chorus put forward a claim to Heraclean orgē on the part of their playwright. And I've given you some key bibliography there on the PowerPoint and handout 3. This claim and the overall iretic texture of Wasps also play an important role in the wider debate, and what a long-running debate it is, about how we characterize the anger or spiritedness of the ancient or modern satirist. And, you know, Ralph Rosen's just one good thing to read on that. But where Wasps explores the comic possibilities of male juridical anger and the poet's own claims to be a hostile satirical passion, Lysistrata operates with a much wider canvas. It is full of references to and enactments of male orgē in a variety of social contexts, on stage and off. But it also plays with archaic classical and Greek tragic stereotypes of female anger in significant ways, again in a variety of different contexts. And yet the role and representation of orgē, cholē, dyscholia and related emotions or affects in Lysistrata have received very little attention in current scholarship. William Harris's big book has one 66-word paragraph on the play, and it doesn't come up in Danielle Allen's work on anger and legal punishment in the places where I'd expected to find it. Indeed, it's part of my argument that Lysistrata offers some significant moments of critique in relation to the representation of male anger as a legitimate practice of democratic citizenship. And by referring to anger as a practice as much as an emotion, I'm here drawing on the important work of Sarah Ahmed on the role of emotion in modern, or affect, I suppose we should say, in modern political discourse and ideology. And I have to give a shout out to Victoria here. I learned about Sarah Ahmed's work through Victoria Voll's work, particularly her chapter on Thucydides and the Passions. So I don't know about you, but I find it much harder to follow people's seminar papers when they're online like this than when I'm in the room with them. I think that's a particular cognitive challenge I have. So in case any of you suffer from the same problem, to help you follow things, here and on the handout is a sort of preview of my claims. Aristophanes' Lysistrata, I'm going to argue, discloses a relationship between male anger and problematic tendencies in the field of political deliberation and decision making. This disclosure is framed in such a way that laughter and serious suggestion are not mutually exclusive. To an extent, Aristophanes celebrates Lysistrata's practical wisdom and the women's righteous anger by contrast to the vicious anger of the men. But things are complicated at the end of the play. The final rapprochement between the men and the women contains a crucial reference to their anger. Anger is effectively reinscribed and reasserted as a routine practice of male citizenship in the polis and male guardianship in relation to women and the oikos. The play worries about political deliberation, but not at the cost of losing anger as an important practical and ideological resource for Athens' patriarchal culture. So that's what I'm arguing or claiming. Now I'll start to try to prove those claims. So my next section is called the comic argument of Lysistrata. So to consider the significance of anger in Lysistrata, I think we first need to see where it sits in relation to the play's comic argument. And I'm using the term comic argument in the same way, well, roughly the same way, as Isabel Ruffle does in her book, Politics and Anti-Realism in Athenian Old Comedy. It means the play's activation of a process of conceptual development and enhancement. This development and enhancement are achieved through the contrast, association, or juxtaposition of ideas as they emerge in networks of imagery, jokes, comic routines, and the play's staging of improbable actions. The key assumptions of Lysistrata's comic argument are well known and shared with other plays. That peace is desirable for both Athens and Greece as a whole, that war is disruptive to trade, the economy and religious life, that war is disruptive to interpersonal relations and the normal functioning of the various social and institutional units that make up Athens in particular and Greek polis in general. Now, Lysistrata overlays these assumptions with an examination of the ways in which the oikos and its women folk are especially affected by war. It's implied that these problems might be solved if Greek states achieved the sort of idealized airbrushed unity of purpose and outlook associated with the era of the Persian Wars. But I want to focus on an aspect of the play's comic argument which often gets assimilated to critical debates about its seriousness and the nature of old comedy's relationship to politics, democracy, and the particular status of citizen women in Athens. And this is the play's implication that Athens' menfolk have deliberated badly, taken bad decisions, and require the intervention of the women's advice and wisdom to sort out that mess. So I'm asking two questions here. What's the significance of the fact that this discourse around advice and decision taking is attended by representations of male anger and frustration? And what's the significance of the play's juxtaposition of male anger with objects and material practices associated with the labours and domains of women? Now, to answer these questions, let's focus on the agone or debate scene, which follows the Proboulos' failed attempt to take back the Acropolis from the women with his Scythian archers. In the agone, Lysistrata easily out-argues the Proboulos, criticising the current war and explaining why women could run Athens and its finances better than men. So we have a male citizen of considerable political power ending up at the mercy of some women who in real life would be politically powerless. This reversal of real-world norms is mapped in terms of his visible feminization, as Lysistrata transfers her veil to him, and then another woman gives him her basket. Lysistrata then issues orders that the Proboulos hitch up his tunic and work his wool in a womanly fashion. We also have a later parallel dynamic in which the Proboulos is redressed as if he were a corpse undergoing burial ritual. And of course, the women are heavily involved in those ritual acts, bathing of the corpse and so on. Now, it's important to remember that the Proboulos represents a political office of some topicality for the play's original audience. He's just one of a standing panel of officials appointed after the Sicilian disaster of 4132. He's not given a personal name, and we can't say that the audience would recognise him as anything more than a generalised embodiment of that role. The role of the Probouloi is explained by Thucydides. Still the Athenians, determined, so far as their situation allowed, not to give way. They would procure timber and money by whatever means they might and build a navy. They would make sure of their allies and above all of Euboea in order to bring some economical self-restraint to the city's business. So you've got Eutylea and Sophronisai there. They also empowered a board of elders to enable proposals as circumstance called for it. As the demos are inclined to do, at the moment of terror, they were ready to put their affairs in order. Hetou moi ersan el taktein. Now, this description, coupled with the independent authority to negotiate pay for supplies, which Aristophanes' Proboulos clearly has, leads many commentators on the play to conclude that the Probouloi would have been resented by the Athenian demos. But what the Thucydides passage actually tells us is that the demos were ready to have their affairs put in good order by these elders. And it seems to me that the Proboulos is a fitting adversary for Lysistrata, not primarily because he is authoritarian or quasi-tyrannical, but because it's his specific job to manage the city's spending in relation to the war and to ensure self-restraint, so phrosyner, eutylea, economical thrift, and eutaxia, discipline, in the city on behalf of the demos. What is at stake in Lysistrata is the question of whether these concepts can be genuinely and convincingly aligned with the continuation of such a costly war, costly in all senses. Does the Proboulos and the male decision-taking process which he embodies represent genuine sophrosyner? As we'll see, the Proboulos of Lysistrata is represented as anything but a model of self-restraint, and his propensity to anger is significant for the play's argument about decision-making and deliberation in the city. So the next section is called The Transfer of the Veil, and there's some veiling on vase paintings there. That's my pathetic concession to material culture in this talk. Anyway, Lysistrata's transfer of her veil is a particularly potent and charged business in relation to the operations of anger and self-restraint. By line 526, Lysistrata has pointed out that she and her fellow women were unable to break through the cultural expectation that wives be silent on matters of political decision-making in the assembly. And if you're looking at the handout, this is passage 8, or a bit of passage 8 on the handout. So this is Lysistrata. Before now, for quite some time, we maintained our decorum and suffered, possibly in silence, whatever you men did, because you wouldn't let us make a sound. But you weren't exactly all we could ask for. No, we knew only too well what you were up to. And many a time we'd hear in our homes about a bad decision you made at on some great issue of state. Then, masking the pain in our hearts, we'd put on a smile and ask you, how did the assembly go today? Any decision about a rider to the peace treaty? And my husband would say, what's that to you? Shut up. And I'd shut up. And we hear that Lysistrata's own husband threatened her with violence when she suggested to him that the assembly was doing things stupidly. So this is again on handout 8, but I've got the text here. And right away he'd glare at me and tell me that I'd get a major head bashing if I didn't get back to spinning my threads. Dermon and Nerso. War shall be the business of menfolk. And of course, that's a quote from Iliad 6 and Hector. Note how the form of the husband's threat underlines the association between the normative expectations of women and the physical objects connected to spinning and weaving, which embody those expectations. Political discussion, deliberation, and the giving of advice or judgment on the war are represented as a departure from those objects and activities. This is reinforced by the famous quote from the Homeric Hector. Although, of course, an audience must have noted the contrast between Hector's emotional state when he says these lines in Homer and the palpable anger of Lysistrata's husband implied by hupoblepsas, which I've asterisked there. It's as if Lysistrata has deliberately substituted Hector's pity and intimate gestures of concern with a participle denoting anger, suspicion, and menace. When Lysistrata offers to give the probulos and the other men good corrective advice, she asks that they be willing to anti-croasti. This is handout 9. Listen in your turn, and anti-siopan, be silent in return, just as the women had done. The probulos finds this intolerable, and when Lysistrata boldly orders him to be silent, he replies, keep quiet for you, you loathsome thing. A woman with a veil, kaluma, wrapped round her head, I'd rather die. And Lysistrata replies, well, if this is the problem, take this veil from me and put it around your head, and then be quiet. In her fine book, Silence in the Land of Logos, Silvia Montiglio interprets this moment as an illustration of the interdependence between silence and the veil, an interdependence which is also found in tragedy. This undoubtedly encapsulates the overt thrust of Lysistrata's actions. And we also have the joke that Lysistrata's reuniting of the veil with its normative associations is at the same time an act of transgression of the gendered expectations evinced by the probulos and Lysistrata's husband. But there's a further association of the veil. The covering of the head with the veil is often linked with expressions of anger and subsequent acts of withdrawal in response to insults or acts of humiliation or public shaming. Even that very proactive use of the veil is compatible with its use by women in wedding rites, funeral ritual, as an expression of grief or modesty and respectability in public spaces. In all these different cases, the veil is linked to self-control, as Douglas Cairns points out. And this is number 11 if you're following along in the handout. All such forms of visual cutoff constitute, I'm really tempted to do impersonation of Douglas, but he might be listening. Aggression blocking responses that contrast markedly with alternative expressions which convey unmediated aggression and escalate the breakdown of the relationship. Such alternatives include threats, abuse, acts of violence, and even killing the offender. But the alternative, which is most directly antithetical to our strategy of visual cutoff, is the aggressive and threatening use of eye contact and facial expression, abandoning the normal protocols of ocular interaction as a means of violating the offender's personal space. Now, as we've already seen, Lysistrata's husband accompanied his threat of violence with an angry look, hupoblepsas. And of course, the probulos has tried to stop the women with an aggressive, if comically unsuccessful, deployment of Scythian archers. Early in the Agone, he has openly expressed his extreme anger and irritation several times, and sometimes in terms which emphasize that he is struggling to stop himself from striking Lysistrata. And this is handout 11, and you've got a bit of that here on the PowerPoint. So Lysistrata says, listen then and try to control your fists. And the probulos says, I can't, I'm so angry. There's orgē there again. I can't keep my hands to myself. So Lysistrata's eventual transference of the veil is prepared for in this visually and verbally comic display of anger and threatened violence from the probulos. Lysistrata shows that his anger is accompanied by a physical lack of self-control, and the old woman is clear, both here and later in the scene, that even if this is the normal way for an Athenian man to react to a woman's dissent and to reassert his authority, she will be unafraid to pay back any violence he offers. So I can now move to some conclusions on the significance of the agone and the transfer of the veil within it. Lysistrata's transfer of the veil doesn't just silence the probulos so that he will listen to her advice. It also dramatizes her doffing of an item which would normally signal and yet also mediate feelings of anger or shame on the part of the woman in the face of male anger, including insults and threats. And there is, I think, a clear implication that it is the men who are presented or discussed in this scene who are the ones whose level of sort of physical aggression and negative emotion require the intervention of a blocking device which both embodies and fosters the exercise of sophrosyne. What the transference of the veil does then is underline and emphasize a causal association or nexus between several things. The poverty and foolishness of the men's recent decisions, their lack of sophrosyne and a concomitant quickness to anger, violence, or threats thereof, and finally their assumption that women cannot contribute meaningfully or usefully to their deliberations by virtue of their gender, status, and societal role. The transfer of the veil is a charged moment in which these vicious associations are laid bare. It may well be a funny moment for all the obvious reasons, but there is some serious suggestion too, in which excessive and misdirected male orgē and behaviour is being highlighted and linked to the men's foolishness as political decision makers. What is the implication of all this? Well, the agone as a whole suggests that Lysistrata's husband, indeed all the women's husbands, and the probulos display a sort of temperamental incontinence, an excessive orgē in any setting, public or private. This is an orgē that knows no boundaries between polis and oikos, and it is damaging to both because it clouds the men's judgment as decision makers and advisors. This doesn't invalidate Danielle Allen's identification of orgē as an important practice in Athenian male citizen self-understanding. But when considered alongside other Athenian texts which worry about anger's effects on collective deliberation, for example, Diodotus in Thucydides' Myrtilean debate, the agone of Lysistrata suggests that norms surrounding juridical orgē as an acceptable basis for punishment shouldn't dominate our picture of Athenian attitudes towards anger on the part of male citizens. When framed in terms of its effects on wise decision making and the giving of and listening to good counsel, anger played a much more ambivalent and difficult role. Now I really need to move on to consider the women's anger in the play and the way in which male anger is treated in its happy ending of peace and rapprochement between the sexes. So this is my final section. To a great degree, Aristophanes clearly celebrates Lysistrata's gendered practical wisdom, self-control, and the women's self-defensive righteous anger via a contrast with the vicious anger of the men. First, Lysistrata is distinguished by her self-discipline and cleverness, and we don't have to see her wool-working and politics analogy in the agone as a practicable solution to accept her point that the women of the city have a right to speak about the conduct of the war when it is they who have provided and lost so many sons in it. Despite its illogicalities and fantasy, the play suggests, through the demeanour of Lysistrata, that there is wisdom and know-how in the city which lies outside the traditional male domains of war and politics. And although Lysistrata sometimes purloins quotations and diction from Greek tragedy, and Greek tragic heroines, she's obviously measured and calculated in her expressions of anger. The whole play starts with her wearing an angry expression because none of the women have yet turned up for their meeting. But in contrast to the anger of the probulos and the chorus of old men, Lysistrata's is a righteous anger, a controlled indignation rather than outright fury. And while this righteous anger may sometimes be a vehicle for jokes at others' expense, we don't laugh at Lysistra's anger in the way that we laugh at the anger of the proboulos or male chorus. The female chorus's anger and threatened violence, for example in the parados, is comic, even pantomimic. It obviously references stereotypes of Athenian women as prone to outbursts of filthy temper. But it's noteworthy that in this play, the women's anger and threats of violence are always provoked by the men. And this is my second key point about the women's anger in the play. They never initiate the furious exchanges and standoffs that provide much of the play's visual and poetic brio. Before Lysistrata brokers the final peace treaty between the Athenians and the Spartans, the two half choruses effect a rapprochement via their respective leaders. This is the women's half chorus and the men's half chorus. And this is number 15 on your handouts, just highlighting some bits here. Tellingly, this rapprochement references the men's anger and grumpy disposition. The male leader acknowledges that he removed his cloak out of Ponēra orgē, filthy anger or low anger, or there's lots of ways you could translate that. The woman leader affects a dissipation of that anger by reclothing the man in his cloak. Just as the men initiated hostilities, the woman leader initiates the end to them. Then the woman removes a giant gnat that has been troubling the man's eye for some time. It's been impeding his sight and vexing him. The woman points out that she's doing this even though the man was born douskalos, a grouch. She kisses him, and the man goes into his can't live with them, can't live without them routine. The gnat is clearly metaphorical for the man's anger and perhaps the hot-bloodedness of Athenian men in general. But the woman's indulgent and forgiving attitude is telling. The terms of this final rapprochement indicate that extreme anger is just to be accepted as a male trait. It suggests that anger is a routine practice, both for the general exercise of male citizenship and for the particular business of male guardianship over women. That dyskolia was always there, and one of those gnats will get in the man's eye again. And it is here that we especially see the value of Sarah Ahmed's insight that texts can represent emotions as practices which constitute social relations, bodies, and attitudes. Victoria Wohl sums up this approach well in her chapter on Thucydides when she writes, quote, "The question we should ask is not what affect or emotion is, but what it does. How does it circulate within a society and define that society through its circulation? What sort of relations shape it or are shaped by it?" Unquote. At this point in the play, then, the drama, the comedy gives the game away. For all its perniciousness in the political sphere and perhaps even the household, male orgē is a practice which is constitutive of the patriarchal order and the relations between genders which that order demands. Indeed, the play reveals how the practices of male anger do a great deal of work to constitute the limits of what a woman is supposed to be, feel, and do. And so to my conclusion, I've argued here for a complex picture. On the one hand, a certain type and texture of male anger is mocked and worried about because of its effect on political decision making. A correlated form of female anger can be the vehicle of such mockery and critique. On the other hand, the Lysistrata reproduces and underlines an assumption that citizen men are fundamentally and normatively airetic. Orgē will never be far from the surface of their everyday interactions and activities, wherever they take place. In the end, the play participates in male anger's function to reconstitute the limits of female subjectivity and agency in Athenian life and thought. Thanks very much.